So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it. Hey guys, so just before we get into today's video, I wanted to say that of all the people who have helped me see the intellectual flaws in atheism, none has impacted me as much as William Lane Craig. He has debated the foremost atheists in the world, including people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Lawrence Krauss. I highly encourage everyone to watch these debates. Just YouTube William Lane Craig debates. Now, I obviously have serious theological issues with Dr. Craig, but watching him deal with atheist arguments helped me to realize how weak many of the atheist arguments are when rigorously scrutinized. So check him out on YouTube. You won't regret it. Hey everybody, and welcome to today's show. My name is Jacob Hansen, and today I am joined by Chris Hanna. Chris, welcome on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, real quick, just to give everybody the introduction here, I'll let you kind of tell us a little bit about you and your story real quick, so people kind of have an idea for where you're coming from.
All right. I've told it a bunch of times in the past year, and each time I feel it comes out a little bit different. So it feels a bit like I'm the Joker from the Batman or something like that. But it's all true. There's just kind of a lot of different threads because it's been 20 years since I've kind of been mostly out of the church, but I've always been in and watching and looking around and pretty active in what you would have called like the atheist movement back in the early 2000s, and then later on around the ex-Mormon podcasting scene. I grew up in the same ward as Lindsay Hansen Park, and we were friends. And we were pretty good friends right at the same time that she started podcasting a lot. In fact, I was there and around at the time frame that John Larson was getting big and Lindsay Hansen was coming on his podcast and she was becoming a name. And I was there for most of that. They asked me to come on a few times and I wouldn't go on because I'm kind of generally a person who says, well, I haven't read that much about this situation you're talking about today. I don't know why I should be on the panel or something like that. But the other guy who's on my podcast now, Flip, was there and he got on a bunch of those podcasts with them. So you can find him there. But we were there and around that whole ex-Mormon scene from the start.
What years is that roughly?
2006, 7.
Okay.
Somewhere around there.
Real early on.
Yeah, real early on. It's been a long time though, and I was out of the church a few years before that, and it generally came from I will call it now a typical kind of I won't use any swear words on your show, but a basic B postmodern leaving because I went to graduate school and got galaxy brained, in type thing, and not that I picked up on that stuff so hard, but my exit didn't come from some big old history reading and, I can't believe all this history. It was more of an academic, philosophical, whatever. But it didn't have like a great big exit to it, really. I didn't have some sort of thing like I went and announced to my parents. And I actually tried to keep it pretty quiet for most of my family for a little while. And as they find out, we'd kind of talk and all that sorts of stuff. I never had any sort of situation where my Mormon friends and family came at me and were whatever to me or rude to me or mean to me. In fact, something about the time frame, maybe even people have it now, but like I was bracing myself and I was like saving up answers and information for when they were going to come at me and all that. And then it just never happened. And so for so long, I just kind of let some of that go. But then as time went on, just watching and being around those post-religious communities, they started becoming more religious than the religious communities in ways that irked me and irritated me and continues to irritate me to this day. And I knew where a lot of it came from, maybe even more so than the people acting it out did, because I had been trained or, whatever you get trained in postmodernism in graduate school. I was a literary major and I know you could get like the general philosophy dude who said, well, it wasn't real philosophy if you were taking it in as a literary critic or something like that. But, you know, even since then, I've been reading it and continuously reading it for 20 years. And you can never get to all of it, but I've gotten to a ton of it. And there is, if you try to bring up or talk about any of it to somebody who is a proponent of it or some sort of pedant of it, they're going to contest any sort of thing you say about it. And I know that game in and out. But I continue reading it because much in the same way most ex-Mormons sit there reading like church stuff to come at church people endlessly. That's the way I sit there reading their stuff. And like, it's just kind of almost kind of like constantly, did you see this? Did you look at this? Did you read this? Or do you know that this came from this guy? Did you know this came from that guy? And it just keeps going and going. And I said it when I've appeared on, in the last year, Jonathan Streeter, who runs a Post-Mormon channel, he was the guy who kind of pulled me up out of the dirt, because over a couple years of arguing with a lot of these different ex-Mormons on ex-Mormon sites, me and the other guy on my channel, Flip, kind of got booted out of a lot of these circles, or ostracized, or
excommunicated,
because most of it was just telling people to chill out. We bring up kind of a famous story we brought up a lot of times, but Flip used to love to bring up the definition of bigot and tell them, demonstrate to them that they were being bigots to Mormons, because like a situation would come up, like we'd notice they brag about not hiring Mormons or something like that on one of the things. And then I'm an HR director now, so I'm also heavily trained in Civil Rights Act of 64 type stuff, and that's illegal. You know, you can't do that. Not only is it's you know, discrimination. And and Flip would point out it, and he'd say this is bigotry. Well, lucky for them, they changed the definition of bigotry just a couple years ago to make it sound more ideological or make it fit what they wanted to fit. But we used to do that, and because we would point that out or say something to them, we'd get kicked off of those channels, because we tell them to chill off, like, you're going over the top here. And so that sort of thing would happen a lot. And then I just start seeing in those podcasts more and more critical theory type stuff, and I knew what it was before most people knew what it was. Like, to kind of put into context, Jordan Peterson became a pretty big person for me. I know he's a big person for you, but the reason he grabbed my ear at first was he was the first person calling out what I already knew about for 10 years. Does that make sense? Like, nobody had brought up the postmodern neo-Marxism, and of course they tried to contest that for years, although they don't contest it very much anymore. But he was right, he was correct, and I knew he was right, and I knew how they threw sand in eyes about him being correct about it. So then I started listening to him, and I kind of remember him talking it coming up of him trying to tell people, because we kind of assumed that this guy must be like a Christopher Hitchens type or something like that. And then he started talking about chilling off of religion and rethinking religion and all that sorts of stuff. And I remember right at first that it kind of jarred me, but then it did make me stop and sit there and rethink it. And that's been 6, 7, 8 years and getting into all sorts of philosophies with that and that sort of thing. So then over the past year, just from, like I said, I got kind of ostracized. Then Jonathan Streeter, who's gone through his own cancellations or whatnot, but is still in good standing with the ex-Mormon community, but who knows how much longer, because he's been speaking out on a lot of the postmodern stuff. He pulled me out of the gallows, you know. He pulled me out and put me back on. We started talking about some of this stuff because he noticed that I'd been whatever trained in it. And then from there, we started a podcast. It's not like a podcast. It's honestly just there for ex-Mormons who are sick of all that, you know what I mean? And who are sick of the hyperbole and sick of that sort of thing. And I mean, we don't really even advertise it out. We don't have any sort of growth model or anything, but then through the woodworks, just a lot of different people start coming out and looking at us or talking to us because they're sick and tired of the politics in ex-Mormon world. And so then through there, I got on with the Midnight Mormons. We chit-chat with them and had a couple episodes with them. Then I went on with a quick show one time with Greg. And that's really just been it. Just kind of hanging out and talking and trying to get people to rethink. I mean, that's generally what we try to do.
And that's that's kind of where I I've gotten to know Jonathan a little bit, and I've heard some of your stuff, and it's like, People kind of get the wrong impression. They think that I have this like irrational hatred for ex members and things like that. I really don't. In fact, I'm actually very close with quite a few ex members.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's like the ex-Mormon who, has left for whatever reason, and you can have good conversations with, and you kind of explore the world together. And, I feel like, and a lot of the people who I engage with, that is kind of a lot of the conversations that we have that are the good ones. But then there are those people that are just, dude, they have freaking, Mormonism derangement syndrome or something.
Yeah, that's totally what it is. I mean, that's
and to some extent, I to give the devil his due, I get it. Okay. Losing your faith and all your life wrapped up in this stuff can be very traumatic. And then people, the way they respond to that kind of traumatic loss of their faith, causes them to get pretty crazy and aggressive. And I always kind of laughed because I found that the people who, the people that are out there truly dedicated to like going after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm like, man, of all the things in the world you could focus your effort on destroying and going after, it's like us, like the people who are like bringing you a casserole. It's like, we just aren't like, there are a lot of bad things in the world. And even if the church is a total fraud and all that stuff, like it's not super high on my list of things that I would think need to be gone after. I think actually what you're going after with sort of these new religious ideologies, essentially, I think those are actually a lot more dangerous for all sorts of reasons.
I 100% agree with that. In fact, it's kind of one of my general premises that the Mormon Church is responsible for the society that, the three ex-Mormons on my podcast grew up in and loved and defend and are still friends with all the same people. And we do give it credit for the beautiful upbringings we had and all that sorts of stuff. Another guy on my podcast, Kevin, he is a forever continuing Mormon. And part of that is showing how he and I can get along and see things almost completely the same, even though, I left or whatever. And there's a lot of different things where we still align on a lot of stuff, but I can break down, I can make arguments because I know that, a lot of the people try to make arguments from the ex-Mormon side that it's for sure causing harm. We always joke, the word cause harm. That's, you'll hear it. It's a value judgment, but it comes out of their mouths like it's some sort of academic scientific thing that they're saying, because they're pretty sure everything they say is that. But I could make a strong argument why some atheists like me would want to live inside of the pronomian society of the Mormons more than most other societies that have ever existed. And I do make that argument, and I do also make the argument, as you would, that if whatever cultish things coming up out of that left side of the arena right now took over, it would be trouble real fast. In fact, I call it kind of a general Maoism.
Yeah. No, and I agree. Now, just to kind of give a little bit of context to some of this, just for my listeners. So we've been talking a little bit of terminology that people may not be familiar with when it comes to things like postmodernism, neo-Marxism. These are kind of, to some degree, they've been very politicized terms. But what essentially these are is, and you can correct me if you think these definitions are off here, but postmodernism is sort of this idea of that there is no truth, there is no ultimate objective sort of reality, whether that be a moral reality, and it sees the world as being just like a matter of interpretation, right? And then within that, there's so the neo-Marxists, so Marxism kind of was all based on destroying capitalism and capitalist society and all that kind of stuff. But neo-Marxism essentially said the revolution didn't happen economically because people were too tied and too married to their national identities, their religious identities, all these kind of identities that people had. And so people didn't rise up in the great class struggle. And so neo-Marxism, sort of the post World War II kind of groups, the Frankfurt School, all that, they adopt this. I believe it was Gramsci's sort of cultural Marxism, which was basically designed to not create the conflict necessarily between classes, economically speaking, but break down the group identities that people had as well, and basically foster revolutions between groups because of differences in their levels of power in society. So as we talk about postmodernism and neo-Marxism, that's sort of what I want the audience just at least to be aware of, that that's sort of what we're talking about, is this sort of a philosophy that views the world as in terms of relativism, relativistic truth. It's all a matter of perception and interpretation, mixed with, we live in a world of power dynamics where people are, some people have more power than others. And I don't mean just like political power. I mean like any kind of ability to get what you want. We all have different abilities to get what we want. And they say, well, there are the privileged, those who are able to get what they want, and the marginalized, those who are not able to get what they want because of the power dynamics in society. How'd I do?
You did great. And I joked around. I told you about it before. There's this term, I heard it come up on, I think it was Benjamin Boyce's podcast, but they called it the pedant's gaze. And it's impossible to talk about any of these sorts of stuff because you start getting in your head about if a pedant was sitting there looking at you and they were going to critique all the things you said. And you kind of got to get out of your head, because I've noticed myself over time talking about it, you'll start making so many little contingencies because you're thinking about that pedant. And we should just say it outright. But a typical thing you might get where they're trying to throw sand in your eyes, like the Zizek-Peterson debate, where Zizek, you can pull the moment because all sorts of bred to people think it was just a killer moment by Zizek, where he goes, "Where I see postmodern new Marxist," you know, and you goes, "You, Zizek, you are a self-declared Marxist who reads everything through Lacan and Deleuze, two postmodernists. Like, it's you guys are the ones who married it up, and you it very explicitly did. And so why are you playing dumb with it? Why is it important for you to play dumb with it? Why do you need to throw sand in the eyes with it? Why are you running from it?" And it's the same thing where, like, so the current day, one of the ways they throw sand in your eyes is say, those were two crazy different movements, the critical theorists and the postmodernists. That was totally different. Well, the current day critical theorists explicitly, very explicitly said that they pulled from those two things. It's the genealogy of it. And these are Hegelians, which the Hegelians means they are always trying to marry up two seeming contradicting things. That's their game. That's all they do.
The dialectic.
And the way they throw sand in the eyes about it should say, tell people something about it, and too, that the way they try to hide and run from you naming them and pointing them out. But
so,
go ahead.
I was going to say, so the way this relates to some extent to something I wanted to talk with you about today is people more in, like, there's no doubt. Well, I'll put it this way. We all see the woke movement, and that's sort of the colloquial term for sort of this way of viewing the world, right? It's
their term, which they get mad if you use now. So
yeah, but the technical term for it is critical consciousness. Okay, it's the idea that you now are awake to the power dynamics of society. And now your mission in life is to play that game of those power dynamics. And, you know, for most of them, it's to create equity within the power dynamic structures of society. And the people at the top of the power dynamics are white heterosexual males. And so that's why the patriarchy needs to go. And anyway, there's all that kind of stuff that's built into it. But what I want to kind of pull this back to is to the way that this relates to religion itself. Because what's happened is that I think that the new atheist movement, they had the fantasy that let's get rid of religion and then everyone will get really, really rational, and like the rational utopia will emerge from the death of religion.
Oh, they were so
And
wrong.
and that's not what happened
No, not at all.
at all,
Mm-mm.
because humans are fundamentally religious creatures in a way. And
No, totally. Like I wouldn't even say in a way. I'd say it all is, because there was a time frame where people always thought that that was just like some phrase that you say to try to get you and got you. But no, if I go down to the bottom of the theories, just the same way that these guys go to the bottom of religious theories to try to debunk it, if we go to the bottom of all your theories, there's a mysticism down at the bottom of it, an admitted one. And I don't think there is any that isn't. I mean, I think you've pointed out that Nietzsche kind of gets there, but that's the realism of their situations, because we say the postmodernists say there's no hard truth, but they fail at that, right? Because they'll say that there's a hard truth that well, the hard truth is that the top of it's an oppressor, or they say something like the postmodernists. I mean, they say something like they don't believe in like a grand narrative, but then it's all obvious if you read through all their writings. Like you read Leotard, he's obviously a Marxist and said that he was pushing for Marxists, and hope in the same way that you're talking about the new atheists, most critical people who just do critical stuff always have this thing of, if I criticize it down to zero, utopia springs out. And that's what maybe Karl Popper called like a historicism, or that really is the belief of like Marcuse or people like that, who thought they could. I mean, they also never had to posit anything positive, so they could never be criticized. But if we just criticize all the way down, but the way it comes in like a hard scientific criticism or some Marxist criticism, because critical theory, if you look it up, there's critical thinking and critical theory, which are two different things. Critical theory is explicitly Marxist, but I think in a weird way, they both still act in the same way. You're just criticizing all the way down, deconstructing all the way down, and then you think utopia comes from that. And you never posit anything positive. And utopia never comes out of that. And so going back to Nietzsche, like Nietzsche himself, like still, he didn't live up to his own standards, or he didn't, even a Dionysian cult came out of his own beliefs, or from Siddhartha and all that sorts of stuff. Like he got the closest mentally, in some sorts of ways, and it failed. It still didn't happen that way. It still became religious and a religious cult following. And
well, anytime you're trying to posit something positive, there's a religious element that comes out of it, right? Simply because if you're going to posit something positive, you're going to posit that there's some way that it should be.
The idealism, but like I said, because that idealism, you can say, hey, look, you're kind of doing religion. But what I'm also saying is that if you go back to Hegel and Marx, they're pulling from all sorts of weird Hermetic mystics. Like they were the whole entire time. But even beyond that, we can just say, how it acts in the universe still. It's like a religious idealism.
It's impossible to build something positive without creating a structure, a hierarchy of values, and then you have to ground that hierarchy of values in something.
And there's always like an imagined, utopia or savior moment. There's always an imagined getting there or something like that. And
so I think this would be a good segue into, and I brought this up on a different podcast, but I want to bring it up again because it's something that's kind of like a working model that I have. Let me pull up this little diagram that I have. So basically what this is
I have seen this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and maybe things are missing, or maybe I'm overgeneralizing certain things on it, but there's a certain idea of, hey, in the world, you're going to be on one side of the fence, right? You're either going to believe that there is a God, there's some kind of higher power, that there's something bigger out there, whatever you want to say it is, or you can say that there isn't, right? If you go down the atheist route, right? And the way I see all of these sort of philosophies that are out there is that while postmodernism maybe plays more on the nihilistic front, ultimately things like neo-Marxism and the Sam Harris kind of classical liberalism based on well-being, these all are ultimately formulations of a secular humanistic view of the world, so far as I can tell. Yeah. Because they put the human being at the top of the value structure. Right?
It inverts it, and it purposefully inverts it. I mean, that's kind of one of the ideals of Hegel and Marx, all the way going back. And
what do you mean by inverts it? Tell me about that.
it inverts because it starts from the bottom of the thing, but at the same time too, that being in their view, the being of the human is what's going to become the God figure, but not in the next life, in this life. You know what I mean? It's we are God, we will be God, we'll become God. Even Sam Harris's his AI, the way they're so confident that AI is going to get to some sort of level to give them all the data that they need to know the correct objective moral truths. That's kind of being confident in some sort of transhumanist God that we become or are able to access. And so it's like we're going to get the God here. We're going to make the God here. And they know that if you go down to the
you can even boil it down to Nietzsche's Superman, Übermensch. You know what I mean? It's this same idea of there's that great poem Invictus, right? It's that I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. I ultimately, you are saying that I function as the highest thing of value in existence. Now, here's where I go with this. When I get into sort of the secular humanist philosophy and I begin to examine it critically, because that's what I like to do. I'm one of those ones who like, it's all the secular humanists who like to be critics, but they don't like it when you criticize them and you actually look critically at what they're saying. And that's for sure. And believe me, that's kind of my MO is like, okay, let's critically examine not just me, let's critically examine you.
Well, that's what I was even suggesting it to the Midnight Mormons when they were going into those debates, and I say it to people, and I think you kind of recognize this, but there's a power that the critical theorists realize that if you're in the hot seat, it's the hard part, and if you're the criticizer, it's the easy part, and you can always invert that and do it on them. But all the way down, if we go all the way back to Plato's, nominalism or something like that, we can make you question what a chair is. We can do that if we're going to put you through the Socratic method for anything. And
I have noticed, see, that's I would say the thing that has saved my faith was actually going out and exploring all the other options and going, wait a minute, like, holy crap, like the world is a lot more confusing. And I mean, I've looked at everything from just the hard materialism to, the secular humanist arguments. Now specifically dealing with secular humanism, because I want to kind of focus on that, because that's one that comes up a lot here. And it's the most common one that I see today. I would say the most common religion. And I would say within secular humanism, you have a variety of sort of denominations of humanism, but they're all forms that say that the purpose of life and meaning in life is found in human flourishing, right?
The material.
Yeah. And frankly, I don't necessarily disagree with that in a certain way. Like I just have a much bigger kind of time scale that this all plays out on. But if you're going to posit that human well-being, for instance, to go with the Sam Harris route, okay, this is where I always get with the Sam Harris thing. They always talk about well-being in the ether, okay? But whose well-being? My well-being or the well-being of the collective? And so what you have is, in the way I see it, is you have in someone like Marx, who has the vision of it's the collective that ultimately reigns supreme. It is, or you can even just do utilitarianism. The most good for the most people, that's what wins. The problem is that somebody like a Nietzsche, I think, focuses on what I call sort of an individualist humanism, which says my well-being is ultimately what trumps everything else, right?
Yeah.
And so, or I might even call that a supremacist ideology. It is, if well-being is ultimately the thing that matters most, well, who's to say that I don't, like, why do I have to draw the line around all of humankind? Why don't I just draw it around my tribe and the people that I like? Because these other people, I don't really like them. And they kind of annoy me. And I think that they're inferior and they're a problem in the world. And so there's kind of these arbitrary lines that get drawn within humanism that I think you, by the way, and I want to kind of segue into this, that you were pointing out in that conversation between Peter Boghossian and Sargon of Akkad. I thought that was a really fascinating conversation. Do
Yeah.
you want to take a second and comment on any of that, or just go into kind of what they were talking about? Because I want to explore what you thought of that interview.
Well, it is kind of one of the big conversations that I think a lot of people are a little bit oblivious to, but it's starting to happen between liberal and, I'd say, anti-liberal, right? Anti-liberal, I mean, if people should stop and think about what sort of ties they have to the word or concept of liberal, because when you're dealing with a postmodernist, those are also anti-liberals. But
Yes.
there's an anti-liberal right that doesn't necessarily mean that they're straight fascists or something like that, but they have critiques of liberalism, or the type of post-war liberalism that we've been living in, this hegemonic liberalism that basically they claim turns into this materialist Sam Harris type world where we lose track of sights of the metaphysics of important things and just look at everything as some sort of value to humans. Like the way I could say it is, Oswald Spengler has this book called Man and His Techniques, or another book called The Decline of the West. And part of what he talks about is when the metaphysics of a culture gets dropped out like that and it turns into this, that's when that culture is going to start declining. And so when the man starts looking like the Danube River as, instead of this mystical giant river of a thing that has all this history and mysticism behind it, and just thinks about it, about how many gallons of water is coming through it and how can we use that for the benefit of the most amount of people for well-being, that's the end of that civilization. And there's a lot of thought in these areas of people who've looked at the life cycles of, like you said, when you were taking a look at this, you were taking a step back, bigger look picture. And I almost think that step back isn't even there in the well-being crowd. Although I'm sure if they just thought for 2 seconds, they'd start to say, well, the AI will figure that out for us too. They have that as the quick answer to all that stuff. But the argument between, so Sargon, he was kind of just a classical liberal generally, and Thomas Paine, all that stuff, maybe still kind of holds on to it, but he started listening to a lot of these critiques. Peter Boghossian is kind of just a traditional classical liberalism, probably doesn't know very many of these critiques. I thought it was real interesting because if you listen to both of their conversations, at one point or another, they both call for a God to solve it in a weird way, in the sense of Peter Boghossian needs this AI that's going to explain it, that becomes clear to the knowledge and the mind of all people who read it, to the reason of all people who read it. What if I could imagine that thing up? But I'd say, well, you could imagine that God up too. But then Sargon got to the point of saying, like, we cannot agree on this stuff. We're not going to get to a point where we're going to. I just barely brought this up. It might be long-winded. Stop me if it's too long-winded. But you have two axioms like utilitarianism or deontology. Say I'm a vegan and you're trying to get me to eat a chicken. You'll say you'll kill another chicken if I don't eat one chicken. Or I say no, because I'm a deontologist. But if I'm a full utilitarian, I'd say yes. If I was somewhere in between, you'd say, how about 2 chickens? How about 3 chickens? You start negotiating with me. And so a full utilitarian would just immediately go against his rule to say 2 chickens, maybe, what's the greatest good for the greatest amount of chickens or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas a deontologist, a full-born deontologist would say, you can kill all the chickens in the world. I'm not going to eat a chicken, and everybody else falls somewhere in the middle of that, and you can't come up with a number that we're all going to agree on. You're not going to say something that, like, if we're just using our reason, there's not going to be some number in the middle where some magical AI comes in and says the number's 10. The number's 10, and now everybody can rest assured that as soon as they're threatening 10 chickens, it's okay for, pretending we're all vegans. But as soon as then that just basically shows that the simple fact that we're all going to have a different number, and then there's not going to be an AI system that's written that makes us all go, oh, okie dokie, that's the number.
Yeah.
But both of these guys at some point or another, when they're asking, that's just one little axiom. When they were asking at the level of, if we give aid to a country, do we expect that country to start taking up our ideals? That was their question. Mm-hmm. And is that pushing into those people's ideals or something? So when it gets those big questions, nobody can ever come to a reasoned response on those things that everybody's going to line up with. without appealing to some higher authority that they don't have access to.
Yep.
And they,
but I think Sargon said this in it. I mean, they were talking about, essentially, I feel like they were talking about this idea of, is it wrong to push your values on another group of people?
yeah,
And it's like, I found it to be it's a really fascinating question, because it's like, you don't want other people pushing their, we in modern society, we are against the idea of conquest, right? Where we go in, we just conquer them, take them over, say, all right, you guys are all going to be Christians now, like, or whatever, or secular humanists, or whatever you want to say. And it's like, you just impose your values on other people, right?
yeah,
And to the strong wins. What's funny though is that is not the human norm, and
yeah,
there's no reason that could be given as to why you can't. And Sargon was kind of saying, like, well, who are we to say that these people who don't embrace Western values, like, who are we to say, like, that we go in and just like impose on them, right?
yeah.
Like, if they want to live, they want to live their lifestyle, like, let them live it. If you want to, go ahead.
That's why I'm saying on that side, which is, I think, is kind of an undernoticed or underdeveloped. I call it pomo trad. It's like, it's traditional. It's traditionalist postmodernism. There's always two sides to Hegelianism. There's the right wing and the left wing side, and they kind of understand or get to the point of saying, yeah, well, if there's not going to be a God that resolves this, or some AI being that has us all see the perfect reasoning, it's got to just then be that will to power. And we've either just got to say we should do it or not do it. But then they'll also say from their side, what a lot of their beliefs, that the way the world should be is that we should all separate into individual states, and they can go do their stuff over there. And
see, but in my mind, and this is where I really get like into within the moral philosophy and the way that this all plays into politics. I look at it and I say, if you get rid of God and you get rid of objective moral kind of values and accountability and things like that on kind of a big cosmic scale, the only things that remain are preference and power. Preference meaning what I want, and power meaning my ability to get it. And so, I was listening to their conversation. I was kind of almost frustrated listening to it, because I couldn't help but be like, dude, yeah, you prefer that everyone leave each other alone, and that we all have our own little like areas that we all kind of do our own thing, and we all leave each other alone and live the lifestyles we want. That's arbitrary. What if my value system is, no, I'm going to go and take over the world, and I'm going to dominate all of you guys, and I'm going to take all the resources. I'm going to kill every one of you, and I'm going to enslave you all, and I'm just going to, leave it for me and do what's best for me and my tribe. Right. And my thing is I don't see how anyone gets around that problem, because if it is just power and preference, then we are just in a Hobbesian nightmare. And I think that Foucault, and this is where I'm actually a raging fan of Foucault. Okay?
Really?
Even though I think he is wrong, maybe a raging fan is going too far. Okay?
There's stuff about him that I like and agree with.
The thing is that I think he hits the point home that it is ultimately all about power. And I actually agree with that. If you take a God notion out of the equation, and we are just animals fighting for survival, it's just a Hobbesian nightmare, will to power and preference.
Unless there's a God. Right.
Unless there's something that you're accountable to.
Yeah, which I think comes out. I mean, that we'll go back to Nietzsche, because all those postmodernists lean on Nietzsche, although I don't think Nietzsche would have absolutely loved them, but they lean on him. But Twilight of the Idols, a lot of people, especially ex-Mormon, ex-religious atheist types, just try to lean on to his anti-Christianity and whatever, like that was so cool. He shreds up philosophy as hard, if not harder, than any sort of religion. And part of what he's saying is, like, we should go back to the sophists' way of doing stuff. We should go back to the Athenian way, and before all this Plato stuff, where we're thinking of the good and the ideal. And we should just, the Athenians, if they came across a place that was smaller than them, they conquered it. Why? Because we conquered.
Because
That's
we
what we did.
can.
And they said, well, you don't have to conquer us. Yes, we do. Because that's who we are. That's what we do. And the sophists, like the one that Socrates supposedly demolished, Nietzsche says he respected them more because you just win your argument. Who cares if it's correct or good or true? You just win it. You push it. You force it through.
Well, and that's the crazy thing with the postmodernism, ends justify the means. Ultimately, it's about power and preference. Language just then, there's no truth. There's just tools that we use. Language is a tool that we use to manipulate power in order so that we can achieve our ends. So that we can,
so
we can
this
get our
is
preferences.
You're absolutely right to pick out that the postmodern traditionalists, in a weird way, the way I say it is they're kind of LARPing religiosity to play a postmodern game. Nietzsche even pointed out one of their original guys and said the same thing of him. He pointed out Thomas Carlyle, and he said Thomas Carlyle's a guy who's lying about his religiosity for his own will to power game. And those guys point and pull from Thomas Carlyle. Now, this is one of the weird things, is just like you kind of like a lot of what Foucault said, and as I do too, I kind of like a lot of the stuff that those postmodern traditionalists say too. But there's also a thing, if you go to my second time I was on with the Midnight Mormons a year ago, they said, who has to be in charge? And I said, someone who really believes has to be in charge. It cannot be somebody who's either announcing they're an atheist, because I think sooner or later it's pretty obvious they quickly start seeing themselves as God, or somebody's able to figure it out, like Sam Harris. Or if you have the other side, which is somebody who's faking it, they're the ones doing the will to power. The only answer is you got to have somebody leading who really thinks they're answering to somebody.
Yeah,
we're only going to ever have hell.
No, and you're 100% right. And that's what's funny about my sort of faith, is that when I have come to realize that what I like to do with a lot of people that are non-believers is I like to push them further into their atheism.
Yeah.
I say, keep going. Let's see where this takes you. Because eventually you get to that point to where it's like, oh my gosh, the most logical path.
Deconstruction. It's the acid that holds no container. Like no container holds it. It burns right through the container too.
Yes.
And you guys think that you don't have a container holding up some values. No, you got a container and you got a bunch of smuggled in values.
Oh, they do. They have tons. In fact, one of the great, I'm a big believer. I forget who it was. It was Tom Holland's, this really great historian that I'm a huge fan of. And he talks about Christianity's influence. And he said that our problems today are in large part excesses of Christian ideas like love and tolerance and helping the marginalized. Like, those are not human values universally, not by a long shot.
No.
Okay? And then, but we are so inculcated in a Christian ethic that people now, they want the Christian ethic without the Christianity that basically justifies it. And when you pour acid on the Christianity, you don't get to keep any of it.
You pour acid on the ethic, yeah, for sure.
You're destroying the whole thing. Like, the baby goes out with the bathwater, guys. And what I like to do is, and I find this to be fairly effective, although they get really annoyed when I do it, is I like to push people to the logical ends of their things. And it's funny because all of a sudden they come at me like saying, well, no, life has meaning and there's values and this and that.
There's an objective truth to the universe.
Exactly. And there's moral right and wrong. And it's like, once you start to take it and you flip it like that to where they realize how difficult it is to justify any of their way that they live their life, that's where I go, I can't help but look at them and go, you are a lot more Christian than you realize.
Yeah.
And that's where, and actually it's funny, I learned that, frankly, largely by working with Calvinists,
Oh, really?
who engage in what's known as presuppositional apologetics, where you kind of, now granted, I think there's a lot of problems with that, and I did a whole episode on it, but there's a level of, you have to try and make sense of the world and the way that you act in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that the way that most people act in the world and the way that most people justify their way of looking at the world, as you pointed out, this acid destroys it.
Yeah.
And so if they want to play with this acid and start pouring it on everyone else's worldview, it's like, I just take it and throw it on them. And then and it's like, you guys are way more naked than me. But then we have to ask ourselves, is that truly the nature of the world? Is the world truly a nihilistic, there is no meaning, there is no purpose, there is just power and preference?
Yeah, that's why I generally say, like, any sort of idealism. I mentioned to you that there's been a couple people, one of them your brother I know, who try to claim Jordan Peterson's an atheist, and I say to them, no, they're a Platonist, they're a Neoplatonist, they're an idealist, which looks a whole lot, if you really break it down and get into all the details and all different streams of it, because there's been a million different streams of it, looks a whole lot like there's a God up at the top. That's a one. That's the thing up at the beginning of the thing. And people like Jordan, all that stuff, you can kind of say it's like the philosophical scaffolding that's trying to examine the universe, and it ends up looking a whole lot like what you might call Christianity or religiosity, if you're coming from that.
I would say that traditional theism within kind of the Trinitarian notions of God are basically Platonism.
They are, and they borrowed, and they all got mixed in with Aquinas, and it got mixed in with the Jews with Maimonides. I can't ever say that guy's name. It got mixed in with Islam with Asiven. I can't say that guy's name ever either. And surprise, surprise, it's mixed in with all of your leftist philosophy too. It all came from it as well. All idealism, German idealism, all idealism is using the same framework. And it's because it's trying to say there's something on that universe that looks ordered. It looks predetermined, not predetermined in the Sam Harris predeterminism, because that stuff drives me nuts. But it looks like there was an order or some sort of hierarchy or pyramid to how to understand the world. And you could call it like Peterson, who's using that philosophical frame, which you can say the four horsemen of what they call the four horsemen meaning. John Vervaeke's a guy who's trying to take the mysticism out of that, but who knows how well he does it that too, because it still becomes mystical. But Peterson's a guy who's looking at that framework, and he's negotiating or still playing the game, or saying, like, there's something there. I'm trying to figure out which one is the one that makes most sense with me.
And Jordan just sounds more and more and more like a Catholic theologian almost as time goes on, because that is sort of where that sort of thinking has been done for centuries now. And it is one of the things that I think that bugs me about those who would say, Jordan Peterson is an atheist, is because the way that they define God, the Sam Harris types, the people like my brother, like, if we're going to define God on the terms of the Trinitarian kind of what I call Hellenism.
You got frozen right at define.
Oh, okay. But if we're going to define God along the same lines as the Trinitarian Christians, remember, you're talking about a spaceless, timeless, immutable, prime mover, genderless, three persons in one. It is such a incomprehensible load of woo-woo, for lack of a better term, that it is, Plato, it sounds like Plato. Plato is very much this sort of idea of the forms and this sort of
It sounds a lot like Islam too. If you ever get far into Islam,
Yeah.
The Sikhs. That's how the Sikhs view stuff. It's even just if you get like the random people who declare themselves Gnostics or Hermetics or any sort of thing like that. But um, yeah, but
See, well, I guess my point, just real quick, is that Jordan Peterson fits into that same mold.
yeah, 100%.
It's the exact same mold. We actually, as Latter-day Saints,
We
yeah, you could
embody
say
it.
that
Yeah.
we're not. We break that mold big time. We are not
Mm.
idealists. We fall much more under what would almost be,
Realism. It's
yeah,
almost like
yeah.
this is happening in the real realm of realism. Yeah.
Yeah, and they give us hell for that. And frankly, like, I think that's an interesting kind of debate to have. But the point here is that you have, like, the God is a very fluid sort of concept. And so if you're going to say that anyone, if Jordan Peterson is an atheist, then Aquinas was an atheist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
All of Islam is atheist.
Yeah. Because they're looking for a particular kind of object God in the universe, like a Mormon kind of version of a God. They're saying, well, if you don't believe in that particular God, then you're an atheist.
It's far more Platonist. They have this thing they hold up to, like the one sign. I think it's called like Tawhid or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's actually the same thing that you described with that timeless. You can't draw Allah in Islam, not because it's just against the rules and they'll kill you or whatever. It's because you can't draw him. It's because it's that same sort of thing that just exists outside of all things and time and is everything and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and fair enough. You know, people want to hold that sort of a worldview, but regardless, I think you make a great point there. If you're going to build any sort of a value structure at all, there has to be a hierarchy to the value structure, and that creates an ideal. It creates something that's going to be at the top of the pyramid that functionally, in an idealist system, whether that be Platonism or Catholicism, put something at the top that is ultimately
as soon as you start saying shoulds and you think there's something good or beautiful or of good report that's supposed to be there, somewhere down at the bottom of the stuff that you're going to start latching onto is that same Platonism. It's part of all philosophy, and that's part of one of the things that most philosophers spend their time pointing out. You can look up Rene Girard talks about that, or it's one of the main things Heidegger talked about. And all. If you look up to any of these guys, I mean, I tend to also be somebody who does Nietzschean readings of all these sorts of people, and also looks at every single one of them and says, "What are you getting at?" Whenever they kind of start posing their philosophies or something like that, like as Nietzsche said, their philosophies are confessions as much as anything too.
Yeah, it's more about who they are rather than the actual philosophy. Yeah, for sure. Well, no, that so I guess what was another thing I wanted to say? So here's another aspect in sort of the kind of switch gears a little bit. I've recently been thinking about a particular question that Jordan Peterson's been talking about it. Others have, and it's sort of this, we live in a world that I posted about it in the Thoughtful Saints group too. Our birth rates right now in the West and in the developed world are below replacement levels. Okay. And I don't think there's any secret as to why that is primarily. I mean, I think there's various reasons, but at the end of the day, something in someone's life, X, is more important than having children, whether that be your own personal comfort, your financial situation, whatever it is. You also have people who say the world's overpopulated, right? And Jordan Peterson right now is getting a lot of hot water because he basically was like, told someone, well, like, yeah, you can exit anytime you want. I thought was actually super funny. It's like, yeah, you want to reduce the world population, you can jump out. But his point he's making is that there is a deep anti-human, anti-life sort of view. But here's the thing, I actually take that very seriously.
Yeah, so do I. It's my largest preoccupation with why I think it's worth speaking out against the deconstructors, you know.
Yeah.
But
Is this whole thing worth it? Right? Like, if I knew, there's that concept, it was better that you never were born. And if I remove sort of my entire worldview of religiosity and Christianity and redemption and another life and ultimate justice, if I knew someone was going to be born, suffer terribly through their innocent childhood, and then die at the age of 9, a horrible, painful death, would it have been better that they weren't born at all? If did any well-being outweigh the suffering? Because if life is just suffering and then you die, like, I don't rationally see how that makes a life worth living. Now, the thing is, that's on an individual level. Okay. Now let's take that on a macro scale. All of life, I would say, if you were to sum up the positives and the negatives, the suffering versus that, and I'm talking about animal life, I'm talking about everything. On just a straight up level, like, as a Christian, I have a belief that we're in a fallen world. And I think that regardless of Christianity true or not, I think that's true. I think our world is just broken. And in my mind, like, not to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm like, burn it down. Let's just end it all. Like, yeah, good. Let's have the birth rates just down, and then those of us who are left, let's just drug ourselves up and go out, and with the least pain possible, let's stop the whole train from moving forward. Right? And I can't help but see that as, that's the nihilism that I get sucked into, simply because even if I have a good life, it's like, it doesn't justify all the other suffering on the macro level. Like, and so I get the anti-human, I often put it this way. I think we live in a modern death cult. That's what this sort of acid that you're talking about is. It's death. It's burn it all down, like, deconstruct everything, and then try and get as much pleasure as you can before you die. And why would you have babies? Like, why would you bring another soul into this?
Did you hear that debate Jordan Peterson had with one of the antinatalists?
Actually,
he had one. He had one pretty recently. I forget what the name of it was.
Let's check that one out.
I'd have to show it to you. But
and then real quick, and then I look at the opposite of that is the Christian message. It's redemption. It's a life cult. It says it's worth it because of Jesus Christ. And therefore, the project is not a doomed failure. It is part of a bigger process that actually redeems us and provides us with, great happiness. And so it is worth it to continue the project, because the project itself provides you with the opportunity to achieve the greatest possible, state of being, and being therefore is justified, or something like that.
Well, so there's a level of that if it's all true, you see a lot of atheists argue for, well, why did God let the terrible, horrible thing happen to the human? And if it's all true, it's such an easy answer. I mean, people are thinking like atheists when they ask that question. Like, obviously, if there's an eternity and eternity and eternity and eternity after all of this, I kind of make the joke sometimes that, like, maybe somebody, we'll go with the Mormon heaven where you can visit everybody, right? And so somebody comes across Hitler, and it's 400. Can you even say that word on Hitler on YouTube anymore? Good luck. Somebody comes across Pol Pot or something like that, who was the person who actually killed them after 700 millennia in heaven, and they say, "Hey, what's your name?" Pol Pot, and I'm this guy, and I think I know your name. Like, I think, it's just joking. It's just like, you're not thinking on an eternal timeline. It's such an obvious answer that your question about evil and death in this world makes no sense if eternity is real.
Well, what if
eternity is not real? What if
you never cease to exist? Like, that's the other thing. Then it only becomes about what is the quality of your existence.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's actually, what's funny is that's what my sort of belief is. That's the great conundrum. People think that it ends. it doesn't ever end. And so
Yeah.
the whole game is like, if you know you're going to exist forever, your entire priority scheme gets changed, because
Yeah.
now it's about how do I achieve a state of being eternally that's bearable. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But you can also say, so what if it's wrong? Well, then there's the way that the new pragmatists always sort of view it. Like, what if it is just we just vanish? Well, once again, Spengler in The Decline of the West, he says as soon as a population starts planning at all for children, that's the end. Like it's going downwards. And he pulls up examples all throughout history, that as soon as a larger population even starts navel gazing at all like that, it's already over. But the concept is if those people have that belief, you say it's not true. If those people have that belief, those people will continue. The people won't continue if they don't have that belief. You can make an atheistic argument. You can make an atheistic argument for why that survives and the atheism doesn't. It's not going to survive. It's actually designed to. It's happened a million times throughout history where it's not new. Nothing's new. Not a single thing of any of this is new. And your people, your children, your whatever, sure, there'll be pain. There'll be things that get marginalized. There's things that don't make it. But your people will continue if your people have that belief that there's something greater beyond this. And I mean, there's so many pragmatic uses for people to be believing for something bigger and greater than themselves, for a way to then, you could say, game that will to power or whatever, if that's all there is in this world.
But again, I would say, my critique of that, and I think that's actually a really interesting point, but my critique of it would be, but I feel like there's smuggled into that the assumption that life continuing is the better path.
Yeah, for sure.
And what's funny is like, I have a very hard time justifying that. Like, one of the reasons I place my faith, and I use that term very deliberately, I place my faith, I throw my chips on Jesus Christ, is because the alternative turns me into a nihilistic supremacist who says that we should stop the whole train. Okay. And I don't,
if they don't, like, they don't understand it's going to stop it anyway. Like, even if you think that, like, we'll keep a small amount of people, that's not how it works. It's
but the thing is, again, I would say, good, let's stop the train.
Yeah.
Like, I want the train to stop. And I look at that and I just say, like, I could never live that way. I actually don't believe that. Like, something inside of me screams that that's not right. And so I could never live my life consistent with that sort of a worldview. Because again, now granted, I go back and I say that I truly believe that I'm not fundamentally just a meat computer, like, I think that I often tell, like, this is like one of my little, like, one-liners, is I don't think belief in God starts with an examination of God. I think it actually begins with an examination of yourself and the recognition that you are something more than, like, I just don't recognize the world that the hard materialist says exists, where everything is determinately caused by mechanical like laws of physics, and I think even the science, when you look into the depths of the complexity of material itself and all that kind of stuff, it starts getting really weird and mystical. And frankly, I think that the world is a lot more magical than we realize. And this is sort of at that level of fundamental conversation where I start to go, maybe there is something bigger out there. Maybe I'm not just a bunch of, I'm not merely a chemical reaction playing itself out over time. you know? And when that, and I think that's just self-evident, right? Like the self itself doesn't exist in the
Mhm.
worldview of someone like a Sam Harris. And that's where again, I can't rationally make sense of it, because in order to rationally make sense of it, there has to be someone there to reason. You know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know, and there's a whole lot to that, but my whole point in it is just that as I look at my available options here, as I'm looking at this roadmap, I just have a really hard time going down the no God path. And so the conversation, when I get to that point that I say, okay, I'm going to go down the God path, then I'm talking theism. Then I'm trying to come to understand the nature of God, right? And so I don't know. That's where I tend to go, but those who choose that other path, like, I just don't see where they go.
Well, I mean, we've gotten to watch a little bit where they go. I mean, I'd say there's only, I mean, kind of one of the jokes of the show that we do is we just say, oh, there's dozens of us, dozens, like we know that most ex-Mormons are going to pick up pretty much the same worldview, And that worldview, like we said, and we've always said, because one of the hard things to point out about all of it is that they kind of half start viewing the world materially, just enough to mess up everything, but they don't really also, like, they also still hold on to all sorts of religious precepts. Like, you can listen to John Lynn's podcast, any given podcast, they'll start telling you what Jesus really thought, and you get that from them all the time.
As soon as a materialist atheist starts telling me all about morality, I just roll my eyes. I'm like, dude, you just like, what are you doing?
And so they can't hold to it as much and as hard as they think that they do, and then it just scatters and becomes this kind of, like we said, kind of this inverted idealism. And I don't think it ever takes that long for people at the top of it to become like these Noel Harari types who basically think A Brave New World was an instruction manual, and we really do have a lot of different people who, up at the top, I absolutely believe, view the world that way, and they start really actually viewing us as chickens in a chicken coop, like that question of how many chickens versus this and that. They really are thinking of humans in that way. And at some point, I kind of, we're all worried about an AI overtaking that. Maybe the AI will go crazy. But if we have a bunch of humans who've already started to think of people in spreadsheet numbers, that the AI is already running it. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't even have to be AI. We've already got these self-declared moral kings who think they can figure it all out on a spreadsheet. It's already there. It's already being run by I don't want to say the word I always use for that, but they're people who view humans. They don't view humans idealistically. And yeah, I really get to the point, but saying where do most ex-Mormons or most atheists end up or start going? I mean, it really is, and part of it is maybe just because they were a little bit prone just to be guided by the nose any which direction, and there were people at the top guiding by the nose down this postmodernist route. I mean, it was pushed on me. I went to the university. None of us had any idea why that stuff was suddenly being dumped on us. I didn't sign up for it. Like, I didn't sign up for reading Derrida and Foucault and Judith Butler and all sorts of things, but they put us through it and they jammed it down our throats. And whether people know it or not, they all kind of start picking up that same worldview, as we frequently say in our podcast. Like, not every practicer is a preacher, not every preacher is a theologian, not everything. Like, you're downstream of it and you're doing it. And John DeLynn doesn't understand that he's doing it, and it's kind of one of the things we go around trying to poke out. Like, you are doing it. You're doing it 100%, and we're tired of you pretending like you aren't. And
that's one of those things that I think you bring up a great point there, is obviously your average woke college student, they have no idea, like they're like your average Catholic who's taken mass. They don't understand Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They probably don't even know half the basic tenets of the Catholic faith, but they go every week and they do the Catholic stuff, and they embrace it at that level. And you have so many people now who are living the religion of secular humanism. But my thing is this, is I put all of this stuff within a secular humanist sort of umbrella, because the fundamental thing is they all still have a value structure. They all still have a worldview that is not nihilistic in the sense that nothing matters.
No, not at all. The
They
opposite.
are devout to human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And generally there is some conflict between whether that's an individual's flourishing or the group. And there's a lot of sort of conflict, but especially these bigger picture people, the spreadsheet people that you're talking about, the ones at the top, they have this Brave New World mentality. They have this, we are going to create the ideal society, most good
But we
for the
also
most.
think most of you humans are just useless eaters. Is the actual terminology that some of them
Yes.
use.
Yeah. And so but the thing is that, so there's sort of this church within secular humanism. Okay. It's just as religious of a structure as anything
Those
else.
same academics, if you listen to Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, not that I buy into his stuff 100%, but he's got a lot of different ideas. But it's those same guys that Sargon was listening to. He
Mm-hmm.
calls it the cathedral. It's the cathedral, that media, university, periodical, I mean, what do you call it, newspapers, like type world of, and managerial class. And it calls it the cathedral.
Yep. And they look at, what they're looking at is their vision of human flourishing, because that does seem to be the new God, of the new highest value of those who don't have God in their life as any sort of an ideal or a structure. They're looking at human flourishing in the here and now in this life. But within that secular humanistic umbrella, there are all these denominations. You have the Marxists, you have the supremacists, you have the kind of individual Nietzschean sort of, I'm going to get mine and that's all that matters, will to power. You have, and these groups are the ascendant, that secular humanist movement, that is the ascendant religious movement in the world today. And it's just, in fact, I would argue, it is way more deadly and dangerous than the Protestant Reformation was.
Yeah, I 100% agree with it. I'm scared to death of it. Have been for a while. And part of what I think happens with it is I really do think that they funnel money into, like, as we know in the Gramscian world, into chopping up communities, because the culture is what keeps people away from getting steered around like that. And people think that, oh, we got steered around by all these religions, and they're fully unaware that that was a little nest that was taking care of them for something that was much bigger, a much bigger technocratic machine that was going to come gobble you up and spit you out and treat you like a useless eater. And I used to think of it as a little bit of a joke. And I know people have their complaints about Mormons, that they feel like there's like an insider class or whatever up at the top or whatever. But there's that old George Carlin joke that he said, there's a club and you aren't in it. But there's some sort of level to me that I always kind of thought, yeah, but if there was one way you could kind of be in a club, you could be in a club if you lined up with a certain religion that was going to protect you from that big, great mechanistic thing. Well, it's kind of interesting because one of the persons, Marshall McLuhan, he was one of the main guys who brought up communications theories, and he talked about the future of how communication theory was going to turn into this, and it was going to turn into people becoming part of their machines and looking at their stuff and seeing it all day. And he technically called it, people don't get into it, they don't bring it up very much, but he said he was a Christian, and he said that's the beast. It's the beast that's going to gobble you up, and it's going to, and because he's one of the most famed professors. He's the guy. Have you ever seen Annie Hall? The
I have
movie.
not. I have not.
It's a movie that there's this famous scene in the movie where, what's his name? The main guy from it, why am I forgetting his name? Woody Allen. Woody Allen and a girl are talking, and he's got this professor just blabbing his brains out behind him. And he's sick of this professor talking. And then when he gets tired of that professor talking, the professor says, "You know Marshall McLuhan's theories on this and that and the other." And he says, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "No, you don't." And they argue about it. And then he stops and he grabs, "Well, I got Marshall McLuhan right here." And he pulls him out from the side right there. And there's Marshall McLuhan. He says, "You know nothing of my theory, sir. You're a complete idiot," and that sort of thing. But it's a famous scene. But that same Marshall McLuhan talked about, he predicted all of this, and he was actually a type of a Christian believer who kind of really thought that the whole entire thing was going to be like getting inside of the belly of the beast, of the great big mechanistic thing that was going to just eliminate your metaphysical views of the world and kind of become like this Faustian gamble that where, you know, you're selling off your views of stuff for material goods. And there's so much thought behind this. There's so much thought behind this, and I kind of feel like so many new atheists just kind of think like, well, I dropped my religion, now I'm the smartest person alive. You know, it's or like I dropped my religion, now I got a certificate on my wall for reasoning. Like I look at my reasoning rationality certificate because I left my religion. And there's so much more thought and ideas. I mean, C.S. Lewis fleshed out a whole lot of those same things in little ways. You can like hear little bits and pieces of it come out in his thinking and writing.
Have you read The Abolition of Man?
Yeah. Remember The Men Without Chests too.
That is one of the most prophetic works I've ever read, and he saw all this kind of stuff coming, where when we have robbed human beings of their humanity by turning us into meat machines, to where we are indistinguishable from AI and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of what they're almost like saying now, is like, we're not really distinguishable from AI. And how do you maintain all of the infrastructure of rights? And, you know, we are built as a society, and all the prosperity and all the progress that we have made has come on the back of this idealistic, metaphysical sort of narrative that we've held to. And if that goes out the window, it's terrifying. Now, what do you see as, I mean, if we're going to try and save our civilization, this is a pretty bleak picture. And you know, you got to fully confront how bleak it is. What are your thoughts on, well, actually, before we get to that, I have a theory for how this all happened. And that is I believe at the top of the hierarchy of what I call the influencer class, right?
Managerial class is what James Burnham would call it.
Yeah, managerial class. Here's the thing.
Yeah.
Where do people get their ideas? Nowadays, it's from entertainment, media, you know, books you read, whatever. And all of that, even you could still say religious institutions give us stuff as well. But that class I'm going to call the influencer class, right? They're the ones that people get their ideas from, kind of the masses do. But the influencer class, over the past 60 years, more than any other time in human history, have been filtered through the academic system.
I don't know if it's my side, but you froze it more.
Okay. So
class
So you have the influencer class. So you have the masses right at the bottom. Mm-hmm. We're going to have like a pyramid here. The base of the pyramid is let me put my hands over here. So the base of the pyramid are the masses. It's all of us. But we get, like, where do we get our ideas about the world and right and wrong and everything else? It comes from the class above us that I would call the influencer class, right? This ranges everywhere from media figures to authors to the music we listen to all that kind of stuff. The thing is that historically that class was highly religious. You know, integrated into the religious structure of society. In the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, essentially all of the influencer class filtered through the academic system. And without a belief, and we're increasingly ambivalent about the idea of God and religiosity at all. And so what happens is that our influencer class is now being trained by the academic class. And then you look within the academic class, and you would know this, that in the academic class, there are, at the top of the pyramid, there are key thinkers, the key idea makers. And that's why I think understanding those people, all of a sudden you see all this stuff in society makes sense. Once you understand the ideas of people like Marcuse, like Foucault, like Marx, like Nietzsche, like Rousseau, when you look at the great philosopher class, that they now are the class that their ideas push into society and drive the show. But the difference is, in the past, where these things were isolated to sort of weird academic, groups, now it has permeated. We've watched it permeate down into the influencer class. And now in the Gen Z millennial generations, we're seeing it hit the masses in full.
Oh yeah.
And you're seeing the fruits of it. And it's freaking,
it's not good. I mean, that's why I called it from the start. It's like a type of Maoism, which basically came out of Gramsci, and they did what was called the Long March through the institutions. Rudy Deutschke, who they said that's what they were trying to do, and they knew that the way they could attack everything was through the mid-level institutions. And I think you remember Sam Harris's recent meltdown. His meltdown was because he wants so badly to just believe that our mechanistic, materialistic institutions can be perfect little, not perfect, but he's not that dumb, but he is still a believer that those institutions aim up, and no, it got infiltrated. There's these 3 laws of Robert Conquest that always get brought up, and this the 3 laws of politics, and one is that everybody's conservative about what they know best. 2, anything that's not listed as explicitly right wing will move left wing. And so they say Cthulhu always swims left. It's the Hobbesian whale, or Leviathans always swimming left. And the final thing is that if you're confused about whatever institution is doing, it's because it's probably being run by a cabal of its own enemies. And it's because they know how to infiltrate, and it's in their writings, and they say they're doing it. And that's what's so funny about all this. It's curved off a little bit, but especially like 5-6 years ago when it was first starting to be named, and not to get all religious, but it's kind of funny. Like there's all those concepts of like, as soon as you name a demon, it freaks out, and sort of type of thing.
Yeah.
But as soon as it started to be named, they freaked out and all stuff, but now they're kind of chilling off on that. But for years, I would kind of tell people or argue with people, especially in the ex-Mormon world, and say, they said they're doing this in their own writing. They brag about it. It's not 1 book. It's not 2 books. It's libraries of books. It's all over the place. They said what their intentions were and their ideals were. And this is the flip end of it that I've noticed and been reading and looking at. James Lindsay's been on about it for a little while recently, is that the ones who really, really pushed it too were absolutely coming from a religious, like a full-on mystical religious mindset. And they only kind of faked out the next class below, saying that, hey, it's all science. They have a double meaning of the word science. You look at what Hegel means when he means from the word science. He means a type of mysticism.
Well, I was watching, actually, that's one of the more fascinating things I listened to recently, was James Lindsay talking about the religious underpinnings of Marxism, that Marx should be viewed as a religious figure.
100%. And their ideas, they have a God, which is the eye at the end of history, or for Hegel, it's that super state that we're all going to unify into with the one, which is like a form of Hermeticism, Platonism type stuff. And the thing is, it's not just like. Hegel really did pull that from this guy named Boehme, Boehme. He really did pull that from Eckhart. He really did pull that from a bunch of that. Eckhart's a friar. It's not it's not saying it's like religion because people think that's a cliche. It is religion.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing it. You're doing it, and you've been doing it all along.
Well, and you know, so with this very pessimistic picture,
Yeah.
I have a theory that we are in the embers phase, just the very beginning embers are starting to light of a religious revival. I don't know what that's going to look like. I'm not saying that it's going to be traditional religion, but I think the conversation like the one that we're having right now, I think more people are waking up to that. And they're starting to realize, I have a young man in my ward, great kid. And you know, when you're a teenager, you kind of want to like fit in with the world.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of funny. I'm hearing more and more from young teenager types that like, I don't want to have anything to do with my generation because they are freaking weird and they are whacked out. And
Not
I
just
think
weird. They're stiffs. Like I never would have thought that the funner side. When I was young, I was that kid too. But the funner side's the religious side, and has been for a while now.
well, that's the thing. I mean, they're looking around and going, you know, when kids can't figure out what bathrooms to use, people are going like, okay, something's broke here. When you're out, you know, you're going to swim and it's like, you know, the girl swim team, and all of a sudden there's a dude there swimming with you. It's like, okay, something's off the rails here, and I think what's happening, from what I can tell, is that people are looking at religion now as the new counterculture and as kind of like this other way of doing it. And there's sort of this growth of the sort of quote unquote trad stuff, which can get a little weird and not a big fan a lot of times, but it shows that there's going to be a reaction to this. And I think that reaction is going to open up the religious mind of people in some surprising ways. So while we painted a very pessimistic picture, I have a weird optimism about what this unsustainable path we're on. I think people wake up at some point.
Well, reality always bats last, you know, and the only problem is with a lot of different things. Like I sincerely worry that the end of 2060, we might see more mass stupid technocratic death than we saw a century ago. Like I sincerely worry about that. But then on the other side of it, there could always be another, you know, revival of what we viewed as maybe ourselves. I don't know if you did, but I viewed my youth in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, and I give credit to the Mormons for this, as as perfect of a youth for a society as could be throughout all history. And people don't step back and look at like what all of history really was.
Society peaked between 1990 and 2008.
Yeah. Which maybe that'll happen again another 100 years from now or something after the thing happens. But I worry that other part might happen. And because the thing is like, yeah, the good wins in the end. We'll say, I believe that too, as much as anybody, but what damage gets done in the middle. And there's so many stupid ideas that are floating out there, and so many, like we call Lysenkoism, which is there's all sorts of. Lysenko was a guy who used his Marxist hermeneutics to cause the Holodomor, if you know what that is. Like he came up with these ideas on how to do the grain better in a Marxist way. We have that sort of thing happening in our medical institutions right now, that ideology is taking place over actual science, and the way that side will cock their heads back and scream science till the end of time. And this is one of the areas I do like Foucault. Like if that book, Society Must Be Defended, it talks about biopower, bio knowledge, like the way that those systems can really we make fun of systems, like people are always saying systemic systems and systems, but it really is true. The one area we've seen Foucault write in the past 4 or 5 years is under his biopower, talking about how those systems of knowledge can become oppressive physical dangerous entities that go pushing around stuff that has nothing to do with the truth, only has to do with what they're willing to power. And I think Foucault is absolutely right on that sort of stuff. But well, what was I getting at? But there's so much to worry about that they could ruin in the middle or mess up somebody's individual life or something like that. But I do agree that reality bats last. But you asked, like, how did this thing happen where it all went this way, and how is it flipping back the other way? The bigger picture answer to that is because that's what always happens. That's the cycle. Mm-hmm. But I think the one thing that makes this one different, and everybody, it's the same reason they think they could win this time, is what makes it different is the technology in the middle of it. Because technology can drag it out harder. It can make it so it can, and I don't just mean technology of like your phone or something like that. I mean like the whole entire way they can spreadsheet out the universe, or fake having an economy, or fake data and p-hack things and all those sorts of stuff. Like we are in a bit of a hyper real, to use a postmodern term from Baudrillard, world of we kind of can't tell what's real and what isn't real right now, and that's all a bit thanks to the mechanistic, super technical world that we're in right now. But it'll still go how it goes. It goes how it goes.
Yeah. You know? It is scary. You know, we saw in the 20th century as these ideas kind of came about and got implemented in ways that had more technology to them. You know, we brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, and marched millions into machine gun death. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it was chaos. So, you know, obviously the prayer is that we sort our way through this stuff without ending up with millions and millions of dead bodies.
But I do think, because Gramsci knew to attack your culture, and it's kind of one of the things, and I appreciate you. That's why I latch on to certain Mormons, because Mormonism was my culture growing up. But I appreciate you and Greg and the Midnight Mormons and other people who are holding on to like the view of Mormonism that I had, you know, because there's sometimes that I worry that even the bureaucratic state of what Mormonism is and how they go moving away from cultural things. And I know Brad from the Midnight Mormons has said, well, that's how it's supposed to be. We've got to get it refined down to just Christ. But there's such a level to me of saying, like, that culture was the superpower. That culture was the thing that did hold everybody together. That thing in the 80s and 90s, the basketball, the soccer, even all that stuff, the scouting, the hanging out, the families, everybody knew everybody's name. Nobody knows everybody's name around unless you're in a ward anymore now. And that was the rock against whatever that mechanistic thing is.
Yeah.
You know? And Gramsci knew it. They know it. They're trying to take it down. That's the
crazy thing, is that, like, I'm a big believer in defending the institution of the church itself from sort of the internal forces of sort of within what I might call a Mormon Protestantism that wishes to kind of segment.
Yeah, I've seen you do it.
And challenge the institution of the church. Not to say that I think that the church is infallible or anything like that, and I've tried to be real explicit about that. But at the same time, like, in a world where institutions are being deconstructed and everything's being deconstructed, it's like you need to have something to hold on to, because if you don't, like you said, these
they know it. That's why they're doing it.
And it's part of the plan, you know. Like you roll into it. So, well, thanks so much, Chris, for coming on. We'll have to do this again sometime. I think it might be fun one of these days to get a conversation with me, you, and maybe my brother as well, so we can
that'd be interesting.
Explore it, because I think we obviously, with me being a active faithful Latter-day Saint and you being a fellow atheist, but with a very different kind of unique view. But he also, my brother, is very much kind of anti-woke stuff. But I think that could be a fun conversation. But anyway, thanks so much.
I've seen him still have some. I've seen where he still has ideals and all that stuff. It's kind of funny because, like, there's one of his episodes where he praises the movie Captain Fantastic. And on my podcast, sometime a long while before that, we made fun of it and ripped it apart of how it's this kind of phony leftist idealism, you know what I mean? But I actually think that might have been one of the points of the movie. But if you're taking a step back at it. But yeah, it would be interesting. And I know I am a fan of Jordan Peterson as an ex whatever. I think. I mean, I probably defend him more than even like the average religious person does. Like, I don't see very much. I think there's a lot of people who think that because somebody likes Jordan Peterson or thinks that Jordan Peterson brought up stuff that they're just going along with some sort of fad guy. And I think Jordan's so much more than a fad guy. I think he has some stuff that you need to stop and think about. And if you didn't stop and think about it, you probably let something float by that was something you should have stopped and thought about.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, hey, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
We'll have to do
Thanks
this
for
again
time.
for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.